everyone! Today I'm here to talk about a series that I've read pretty recently that I've really enjoyed and give my thoughts. I'm probably going to talk way too much about these books today, but they were good and I have a lot to say. Good things. Mostly. So yes, today I am reviewing The Rage of Dragons and The Fires of Vengeance by Evan Winter, the Burning series. I know the books look out of order here, but that's just, they were stacked like this. So when you pick them up, they look like that. I am really excited to talk to you about these today, so let's pass more books. I had been hearing about The Rage of Dragons for so long, and I especially heard amazing things about the fact that Evan Winter first self-published this book and became so successful with it that Orbit then decided to pick him up and publish him traditionally, which is probably almost not every, but a lot of self-published authors' dreams. So I had to pick it up, and I think it's worth it. I think he's worth the hype. So let's talk about what this book is about. The Rage of Dragons takes place in a world where, first of all, there's a lot of really cool African-inspired world building, but also these two kingdoms are kind of eternally at war. Not like eternally, but they're just constantly. So the kingdom that the main character is from, they sailed to this peninsula like 100 years ago because they were being chased by something scary and kind of running for their lives. And they land on this peninsula that's already occupied, and they're kind of fighting just for a place to settle. And they see the people who they have just met on this new land. They see them as kind of savages. They don't seem very civilized to them. And so they're kind of just trying to beat them back and claim a place for their own so they can survive. The people who are native to that land, they don't take that very well. So they just fight back, and they're kind of like this endless wave of warriors. So we have this kingdom made of the chosen and the nobles who are mostly just trying to survive and are constantly at war, and their society is now kind of built around war because they have just been fighting nonstop for 100 years. And the way that the geography works, they are kind of trapped on this peninsula, so they could either try to fight the raging ocean that is really dangerous to try to go back to their homeland that they are pretty sure is really dangerous for them, that they can't go back to, or they can just try to fight it out and try to keep claiming a space for themselves against the natives. The world building is very African inspired, which I found so fun. I really love just very not medieval England world building, you know, like branching out to very different cultures and having different experiences is so fun for me. So I really loved the world building in this book. Like I mentioned, their society is structured off of war. There's a very obvious caste system, like a hierarchy, not exactly castes. There's the nobles who have this noble blood and who are supposedly always bigger and stronger, and there's, you know, levels to them depending on like where in the military they are. And then there's the chosen. They also have their own levels depending on like where they fall in the hierarchy of the military, essentially. It's also a very much like the nobles despise the chosen despise the nobles, and the nobles look down on the chosen and don't really respect them, kind of abuse them sometimes. Throughout the book, we are following our main character, Tao, who is a lowly chosen, or common. It's common, isn't it? Common is the word they use. But there's a reason that the word chosen is used. Anyway, so Tao is a normal kind of nobody, and he's just kind of grown up training under his father to get into the military one of these days so that he hopefully doesn't have to live life as like a drudge or a slave. If he can get to like a decent spot in the military, like life could be pretty good for him. If he's not in a good spot in the military or doesn't even make it into the military, like life could be pretty not fun. And pretty quick you'll find that there is something that happens that sets Tao on this really passionate path toward revenge, and it becomes the only thing that he thinks about. And so I won't tell you what, but that's where the story really takes off, when he has this moment that sets him on this path of revenge. It is action-packed, and I'm so excited to dive in and tell you more about what worked so well in this book. I guess I should say these books. I will be focusing probably mostly on The Rage of Dragons rather than Fires of Vengeance in like my examples and things I say, just because it's easier to talk about the first book, rather than the second book. But just know that for the most part, the things that worked well in book 1 also worked well in book 2. So I wanted to start by talking a bit about Tao's character. In the beginning, he's set up well enough that like you are sympathetic to him and you start to understand this world that he's grown up in, and I mean you want him to get the best from life. You're cheering for him. And so then as he starts going down this path of all I want is vengeance, you understand why he makes all the decisions that he does, but you don't agree with all of them. There were just so many places in this book where I was like, oh, don't do that, or oh. So he's going along making decisions that I don't necessarily agree with, but at the same time, I'm so in his head that I understand why he's making these decisions. I understand exactly where his motivation is coming from, and just everything he does makes so much sense, even though I like would personally never do it or just think like that's a bad idea. But it makes so much sense because we're so in his head and understand exactly where he's coming from. Honestly, I've never really been drawn towards morally gray characters. I don't know if you really can define Tao as that or not. He's just really angry and desperate, honestly. I don't know. You can definitely question some of his actions and attitudes and things, but I think his perspective just comes along so well, and I couldn't help but keep cheering for him. I feel like that's not easy to pull off. The side characters throughout the first book especially were a little less developed than I might have otherwise liked, right? But at the same time, it actually really makes sense that they're not very developed in this book especially. They really do flesh out a little bit more and kind of come more alive in the second book and become a little bit more meaningful. Not that they're not meaningful in the first book, but they're just, the side characters kind of are more fleshed out in the second book. But in the first book, you just don't get as much time with them because Tao himself is such a loner character. So part of me is like, oh, I want a little more depth to the side characters, but at the same time, it makes perfect sense that I don't have a lot of depth to these characters because Tao is like not the kind of person who's gonna go talk and chit chat and get to know them and really be buddy. Like, he's a loner. So it makes so much sense. And honestly, there's enough groundwork laid for them in this first book that when they do really start to have more to do and more that happens in the second book, like it comes together better. So don't be super disappointed by the side characters if you feel like they're not good enough. They're fine. Tao's just a loner. Like I said, this book is action-packed. Both books are. And here's where I really kind of just get wowed, especially because not only is Tao's character so well written where you're like cheering for him but also cringing about every decision he makes, the action is just so well paced. And this is tricky because almost every single scene, especially in this first book, the second book, you do get a little more variety. You do get a little bit more like political discussion and stuff like that. The first book, though, like almost every single scene is some sort of fight, some sort of combat. There's either a training session or a duel or a battle or like something, like somebody is fighting somebody else almost every time. And this is the kind of structure that, if not handled very carefully, could get so boring, right? Because I mean, if you were in the mood for just like battle after battle after battle, you wouldn't care, right? But most people, when they come to an epic fantasy story, they want more than just fight scene after fight scene after fight scene. They want some character growth in between. They want to see a plot develop and a reason for the fight. But here's the reason why this fight after fight after fight structure actually does work so well. And don't take this the wrong way. There are scenes where fighting doesn't happen. There are still breaks. They're just brief and there's just a lot of action. So the first reason is that Tao, his motivation and his purpose is always crystal clear in these fights. You know exactly what he wants to get out of it. Maybe it's like, his kind of audition to get into the army, or maybe it's this is the fight where he thinks he can get some revenge on somebody, or maybe he's in a training session and he's focused on improving XYZ. But just like every scene is so specific to what he's, not only the like immediate danger, but how it fits into his bigger picture of like where he wants to go, because that's always at the center of it. It's never like, well, here we are at another fight scene. It's like, no, this is like the next step in what Tao wants and what Tao is doing. And so even though there's so much action, it's actually all very character driven, because it's all based on Tao and what he wants and what he needs. Another reason this worked so well is that the stakes for every fight were always clear as well, and they naturally rose throughout the book. Especially it was done so well in this first book. The second book, there wasn't as much of that progression, mostly because Tao in the first book is like growing his skills so much as a fighter, and so you're always seeing, well, what now that your skills have increased? Oh, what now? Oh, now this guy's even better than the last guy you fought. So now how are you going to work through this, right? But like we're seeing the stakes raise naturally. Not only is Tao progressing, but you're seeing the difficulty progressing, and it comes very naturally. And then you like look back at the beginning and you're like, wow, like now I really understand where Tao was at in the beginning. And the other thing that I want to mention that made this work so well, this kind of structure with so many fight scenes back to back, is that every time there was a fight, again, it's linked to Tao's purpose and his motivations. And so Tao isn't coming at these fights just as, okay, gotta win another fight. He's thinking creatively about how to get what he wants, not just how to win the fight. And so sometimes he realizes, okay, to win this fight, technically all I need to do is this. Technically to survive, all I need to do is this. Or, oh, you know what, I could trick these guys if I play on their expectations and do this. He becomes very creative in the way that he goes about these fights and wins them. And sometimes he loses too. He does lose fights, like he's not constantly winning. So there's a really great mix of him learning lessons, being creative with how he solves the problems that he's faced in these really intense, quick action sequences. And it's a really fun ride to see just so many different ways of approaching these different combat scenarios. It really feels like you're always invested in the fight that's happening and interested to see how Tao is going to get through it. That kind of pacing is just not easy to pull off. It takes a lot of thought. It takes a lot of care. I know I'm a book editor. Like, I've seen a lot of books with bad pacing. Like, this is put together so intentionally. It's amazing. Another thing that I personally appreciate about all this action is that it's never written in like an intentionally gruesome and graphic way. It's very to the point of, this person swung and this person, counterattacked or whatever it is. Sorry, I make it sound so lame. It's well written. It's just that it's not focusing on the blood and the gore and the violence. And so even though there is so much violence, if you think about it, there is some really gnarly things happening within these combat scenarios. But it's not so in your face, and it's not constantly glorifying all this blood and gore, right? It's manageable to read and digest all of that. So I really appreciate how it wasn't so like in your face graphic. And actually, there is one scene at the end here that is kind of graphic in the climax. There's a bit of like a, whoa, you're actually kind of describing some of the blood and gore now. And it made that scene more impactful because that was like the one scene that had a little bit of like the gritty details in it. So I think it was very tastefully done. And this book is long. You've probably noticed it's a thick one. I like them thick and chunky. And the thing is, it doesn't feel that long because the pacing is keeping you going so well. So similarly with book 2, it's really long and like pretty much the same length as the first one, and it just doesn't feel that long. And what's interesting is it's a slightly different structure to the plot. It's a little bit more of like, instead of like fight scene to fight scene to fight scene to fight scene, it's a little bit more of we are just going to do the next thing that lets us survive and live another day, or that we're kind of cornered here and we're going to do our next best, hopefully smartest move that we can. And it's just kind of like one tricky situation after another, and always like, okay, we gotta like, now this next thing just happened, or we got this new piece of information, now we have to make this next decision. Okay, here's our next game plan, and we're gonna go for it. It kind of feels like they're just like constantly taking the next step to survive. And so it's very intense that way, because there's just the pressure never leaves off. And so even though there's not fight scene after fight scene after fight scene in this one, there are still a lot of fight scenes. It's still action packed, but there's a little bit more, like I said, of the political drama, and a little bit more talking, a little bit more of characters kind of coming together. I remember getting about halfway through the book and kind of realizing like, oh my gosh, I'm halfway through the book. And if you think about it, not a ton has happened, except a lot has happened. And it's just the pacing, again, because of like the intensity and the stakes, the pressure on the characters and the scenarios they're in, it just keeps things propelling forward. So here is where I'm going to finally talk about my actual complaints. I didn't really have a lot to complain about. Like I said, the first book, the side characters were like a little weak, but it also made sense. The second book, there were really only like 2 things that I felt like I might have tried to improve somehow had I been editing this book. So the first thing is that in the very beginning, Tao gets this major injury, and it's like, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. And Tao, he has had to endure a lot of pain throughout the first book and now into the second book, and you learn that he's not a quitter. He does not give up. He pushes through pain. He pushes through being tired. He pushes through being hungry. Like, he will push through it. He's a tough guy. He doesn't care like what happens to him. He's gonna like meet his end goal. Working through his physical limitations is like another battle for him. But the kind of injury that he gets in the beginning of this book just feels like a little bit too much. Like a little like, oh, can you actually handle that? Can you actually live with that injury? Can you really ignore that? Not that he's like ignoring it the whole time, but I just felt a little bit like that's a big deal. That's a big injury. So it just felt slightly unbelievable to me. It was fine, but I was a little bit like, once in a while, just like, can you really handle this? I don't know. And I think it was partly because it came so early in the book that I was like, well, now what else are you gonna deal with? And also partly, I don't handle pain very well myself, so it's hard for me to comprehend like how he can just act like nothing happened. I mean, he's obviously still in pain and he has to fight through it, but it's like, I don't know. It was just slightly unbelievable to me. But obviously not the end of the world. I still had a great time with this book. The only other thing that I would have really like petitioned for more to alter in this book is just how Tao's character arc climaxes at the end, because there's a really satisfying development where he realizes something and makes a really big decision that like he never would have made at the like middle of book 1. Like he never would have considered doing what he did at the end of book 2. It's so satisfying because he kind of gets what he wants but also doesn't, and he is just starting to realize the things that he thought were black and white are not black and white, and it's really, really satisfying. And I can't really tell you anything about it, of course, because spoilers, but it's just such a satisfying like direction for him to go. But the way it was written, it wasn't fully satisfying because it was a little bit more focused on the let's get to the next scene, let's get to the next fight. I just wish we could have had a little bit more time to sit with him and what he was feeling in that moment, because it was so brilliant the way that he realized these things, the way that his character was moving forward. We just needed to sit there with him just for a little bit longer and really like feel with him the things that he was feeling just a little bit longer, and then we could have moved on. So that's my biggest complaint of this book, but it's also, I mean, kind of minor, especially if you're a more plot-driven reader than a character-driven reader. You're like probably going to be like, it was fine, that was just enough. But I think we could have just sat with Tao and his feelings just a little bit longer. Overall, I thought these books were fantastic. I really, really enjoyed them. I had a great time reading them, and I am so excited for book 3. Like, both books leave you on great cliffhangers. They have great climaxes, and I, like, as soon as I finished book 2, maybe not even as soon as, maybe I was like in the middle of it or something, but I was like looking up Evan Winter's social media and his website and trying to find out, like, have you been announcing like how far you are into writing the 3rd book, when it might potentially come out? And there's like nothing. There's like no information out there. But someday we'll get book 3, and I'm so excited for when that day comes. I would highly recommend reading this series, even though it's not finished yet. Obviously, if you won't read a book series before it's finished, then wait a little bit, but keep this on your radar because it is great. It's fantastic. If you have read the Burning series or have wanted to read it, whatever thoughts you have, I'd love to hear. Let me know if it worked for you the same way it did for me, if there were other things that maybe you had complaints about that I didn't, or if you're excited to read it. Does this make you want to read it more? And if anybody knows anything about book 3 being written, being finished, please tell me. That's it. Let's go past more books. Don't hit the microphone. Don't hit the microphone. Whoa. Don't hit the microphone. Or navigate around this thing. Don't hit the microphone.